Hey, what's up, guys? So I'm gonna do this tutorial today on how to EQ your tracks, how to get your tracks to sound clean, not muddy and cluttered. This is a really tough subject for a lot of new producers. It's even still tough for me. It's not an easy thing. Still takes me a long time to go through and EQ everything properly and clean up my mixes. So, I mean, I don't think this is ever going to become an easy process, but once you learn what frequencies do what, it makes things a lot easier to fix your mix when you know what does what. So I'm going to show you this track. This is my new track that will hopefully be coming out in the next month or so. On Dirty Corner Recordings. I'm going to show you what it sounds like with the EQ on, and then I'll A-B it without the EQ on. I'm going to also show you what it sounds like without the mastering chain on, because that will change it as well, and you should be doing all your mixing and all your EQing and all that stuff without your mastering chain on. The only thing I'm going to have on is the limiter, but that's just to make it loud enough so you guys can hear it really well. That's not going to affect the way it sounds at all. So let me show you what this sounds like with EQ, and then I will go to this file over here where all the EQs are turned off, and I'll play you that so you can hear the difference. And then I'll go through each EQ to show you what I've done, and try and explain the best I can why I've done what I've done. So hopefully this helps. So here's the track with all the EQ on and without any of the mastering stuff on. So here we go. Okay, so now I want to A/B it with this one where all of the EQs are turned off so you can hear the difference. Let me go ahead and play this. Okay, so I think that is enough of an example. That sounds awful to me. I'm listening in my headphones. I don't know how well you're going to be able to hear this if you're just listening over like laptop speakers or your computer speakers. You may not get as much of the difference, but in headphones, you're gonna hear a pretty big difference. The bass sounds terrible. I mean, the mix just sounds crappy. Let me go through, and I think, okay, so let me go through, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to play this, and then I'm going to go through, and I'm going to turn all the EQs back on. Yeah, I'll turn the EQs back on while it's playing so that you can hear the difference that it'll make. Let me see. I think I can maybe do it by doing this. Man, I can't do that. If anyone knows how to do this, I've seen people do it in Pro Tools. I don't know if Logic can do it. If anyone knows how to do it, send me a message and let me know how to do it. But I know that there should be a way to turn on. I wish that there was a way to, like, since I've got all these selected, if I turn this on, I want it to turn on everything that's selected on this top row. I don't know if that's possible to do. If you know how to do that, can you send me a little message in the comments and let me know how to do that? That would be awesome. Okay. But I'm going to go through and also, I guess I'll just turn on these one by one so you can hear the difference that it's making. So yeah, here we go. Okay, so hopefully you can hear the difference in that. Hopefully you can tell the difference. If you can't tell the difference, you're going to have a really hard time EQing your tracks. So let me go through and show you what I did, and I'll try and explain the best I can as to why I did what I did. let's start with the kick. And the kick is these three separate. These are all my kicks. These two right here, sub kick 1 and sub kick 2, actually are the same thing. It's just it was only playing on every half note instead of every quarter note, so I had duplicated the track and then put it on every quarter note. So these are the same exact thing. They're just playing quarter notes instead of half notes. Okay, so I'm going to go through. I will solo the kick so you can hear what it sounds like with the EQ and without the EQ. Okay. So here's the kick with the EQ on, and then I'll turn it off. Actually, let me turn it off first. Oops. Now with it on. Okay, so you can hear the difference. When the EQ is on, it's nice and subby, and it's also got a lot of punch to it. Without the EQ on, it's kind of boxy and just kind of flat and muffled. And it's funny, like when I'm going through and picking my samples, the samples sound good on their own. That's why I picked the sample, because I'm like, oh, okay, that kick sounds really good. I like the way that kick sounds. So I throw that in my track. But then once you start throwing in all your other instruments and everything's layering on top of each other, you've got tons of instruments all trying to fight for the same frequency space. And so what your goal is in mixing and EQing is to try and create space. So you're trying to create a little pocket for the kick. You're trying to create a little pocket for the snare, and everything's trying to fit inside this little box, and everything's got to fit into its own little space within that box. So yeah, what I did was on this first kick, which is like the main, this one down here is just pretty much pure sub. But here's what I did with this. I boosted, I cut out from 44 hertz on and down, because I don't know. I left a little of room there for the sub, but most of what's going to be under there you're not going to ever hear anyway. So I cut it there, and then I boosted 80 hertz and 120 hertz, and I've got a fairly wide Q on both, so that's why you see this. I've got a fairly wide little boost right here, and that's where a lot of your bass frequency is going to be. That's where that thump is going to come from. Now, this region in here where you see this kind of cut out at the, I guess it's starting at just above 200 hertz, and it goes all the way to 2000 hertz. I've cut that mainly to get rid of some boxiness, but also to leave room for some other instruments. They're going to fill in that frequency space. And then I rolled off the highs because you don't really need that either. So let me show you just this. Okay, so I'm going to show you just this with the EQ and without. And this is without the subby. So this is no EQ. And then with. So you can hear how that really cleans that kick up. Now, when I was going through and picking that sample, it sounded great on its own. But after I EQ'd it, it sounds a heck of a lot better, I think, especially for this track. And now that I cut all this stuff out of here, it's leaving room for other instruments. Now, the sub, both of these EQs are the same because it's the same kick. So I'm just going to show you the one. Not a whole lot of EQing going on other than cutting frequency, just doing a high cut and a low cut, because all I want is this range right here because it's just sub. I don't need any of these highs. I don't need any of these mids. All I want is this low end of the spectrum here. That's all I want for this sub. So let me show you what just the sub kick sounds like with the EQ and then without. Or without and then with. Okay, so it's a really, really subtle difference on this, and mainly that's because this is just a subby kick, and even though, let me show you with this turned off. With the analyzer on, okay, so let me roll this back. So you can see there's a little bit of stuff happening here. There's going to be some stuff that's happening here as well, but it's so low that you can't really hear it. And that's why I'm cutting all this. I'm cutting all this because there's still some really, really low frequencies down in here that are taking up space. Even though you may not hear them, they're still there. So you want to cut all that out. Since it's not affecting the sound anyway, you might as well cut it out. So below 30 hertz, you're not hearing any of that anyway, so you cut that out. Because if you've got a bunch of stuff under there, you're building up that. If you don't cut out 30 hertz, what's going to happen is you're going to have all these tracks have a little bit of that 30 hertz frequency, and they're all stacking on top of each other. So you're going to have tons of 30 hertz stacking up on top of each other, and it's going to end up giving you a lot of rumble in the track, and you don't need that. So it's good to just cut that out on almost everything. So sometimes you can cut higher, sometimes you just want to do 30 hertz. So anything below that's not audible, so just cut it out anyway. And what I do is I will move this. So I did this high cut right here, right? And it's at 230 hertz. So what I'll do is I will sit there and listen to it. I'll solo it. And I'll start with it all the way here. And then I'll start bringing it this way until I hear it affect the sound in a negative way. And you know, I may get to 130 hertz, right? And it's starting to affect the sound. I'm starting to hear a difference in the sound, and I don't want to hear much of a difference in the sound. So then I bring it back to a point where it's cutting all that stuff out, but I'm not hearing a drastic change in the sound itself. And I'll explain that I'll explain that a little bit better too when I get to my synths. It'll probably make a little bit more sense when I get to the synths, and I'll show you what I mean. So again, let me show you the kicks again. So with EQ and then without. Pretty big difference. Now let's go to the snare. And let me show you the snare with and without EQ. So here's the snare with EQ on. So that one's a little bit more of a subtle difference. You'll hear the reverb in there as well because I've got it being sent to this reverb. And I've got that EQ as well. Took out the low end on this reverb and took out some of the highs on the reverb. So the snare is a little bit more subtle than the kick, I feel like, but you can definitely hear a difference. Without the EQ on, it's got a higher frequency response. Like I'm hearing a lot more high frequencies. And so what I did on this was I cut out to 130 hertz, and let me show you what I'm talking about, how I was talking about how you roll this up or down until you start hearing a change in the sound in a negative way. So let me show you what I'm talking about with that. So I'm going to start at 0, and I'm going to start moving it up until you hear a difference in the sound, and then I'm going to roll it back to where it's not making a big difference in the sound. Here we go. Okay, so right there, I don't notice any difference in the sound itself. But if you look at it, when I pull this back, see all that's going on right there? There's frequency there. There's the low end frequency, but you're not really hearing it. So I might as well get rid of it because the snare is pretty much all high end stuff anyway. So it's like mids and highs. So I can get rid of all that low stuff because you're not hearing it anyway. So I'm going to push it past that point so you can hear what I'm talking about. Okay, so right there, it's starting to sound a little bit kind of boxy, which is why this was kind of the sweet spot. So 130 hertz was that sweet spot. So I'm not hearing a difference in the sound by cutting out those lows. Once I got past the 130 hertz range, it started changing the sound in a negative way to me. So I started hearing it sound a little bit more boxy. So I don't want that. So I rolled it back to 130 hertz. So I start off all the way at the bottom, roll it up. Once it starts affecting the sound negatively, then I'll roll it back. And then I'll roll it back up until I get to that sweet spot. So I kind of go back and forth with it until you get that sweet spot. And then what I did as well is I boosted these mids at 500 hertz. And a lot of this is just kind of messing with things, to be honest. I'll just mess with different frequencies. I'll boost stuff, I'll cut stuff, and sometimes things work, sometimes they don't. And there's no right or wrong way to do it. I mean, you can EQ things super crazy sometimes, and it'll fit your track and sound great in the track. So just kind of mess with things until it sounds good to you. EQing is it's such a difficult thing to try and explain. You kind of learn after a while what sounds good and what doesn't. When you listen to other tracks, I mean, I always, when I'm making a track, I'll pull in another track that from a producer that I really respect, and I like that track, I like the way it sounds, and then I will try and emulate that same sort of sound myself. So I'll listen to what that snare sounds like in that track, and I'll try and emulate that in my track. I'll listen to how that kick sounds in that track, and I'll try and emulate that. That's the best way for me on how to learn how to do it. So yeah, back to this. So I boosted 500 hertz at 3 dB. I boosted with a medium Q 0.71. Then I boosted 3500 hertz. That's where a lot of that snap is going to be. And then I rolled off these highs just a little bit so that it wasn't so harsh. And then again, here's what it sounds like. So you can hear when I turn the EQ on, it's got more body, it's got more substance to it. When I bypass it, it sounds to me like it's just more high end than anything. That's what this boost was here at the 500 hertz range. It was giving it a little bit more body. And then rolling off those highs helped with that harshness. Now, what I suggest doing as well is I suggest going through your track, and I will solo it, and then I'll also mess with the EQ when I'm listening to the track as a whole, because you want to hear how it fits in the mix. You don't want to just EQ with how it sounds soloed, because that can be really deceiving. Things can sound great soloed, and then you turn it on with the rest of your instruments and it just gets completely lost in there. Even though the EQ sounds great, it's getting lost. So you may need to do some cuts or some boosts in places to make that stand out in the mix a little bit more. So I do a little bit of both. I mainly solo a lot with my low cuts and my high cuts. That's when I'll do the soloing to know how far I can take it, and it's not affecting the sound negatively. And then all these other little boosts, I will A/B it with soloed and in the mix, and that seems to work for me. Next up, we have this square. So this square, here's what it sounds like with the EQ. And then without. Super subtle. But it does clean it up. It does make a little bit of a difference. And so here's what I did. I took out all these lows. Again, I just roll this up until I hear it affecting the sound negatively. Because I don't want any of these lows. I want my subby instruments. I want that sub kick. I want my bass. I want those instruments taking up this range. This is all like kind of a mid to high range instrument. So I don't need... This is mainly a higher range instrument, so I don't need any of these lows. I mean, even this mid section, I've got a lot of this stuff cut out as well, and I've got this higher stuff boosted because I just want mainly highs in this sound. So I rolled this off to 200 hertz took out 400 hertz. Your 375 hertz to about 500 hertz range is going to be your muddy region. When people say your mix sounds muddy, that's going to be the range that you want to focus on doing some cuts in that range will really clean up your mix a lot. Also doing cuts like this, where I'm cutting out all these lows, that's going to help with muddiness because you're not cluttering up all that frequency range. But the 375 to 500 hertz range or so, around that range is your mud region. And you can do a lot of good on your tracks just from doing some cuts there. Now, that's not to say that you should cut everything there, because you still want stuff in that frequency range. When you're listening to your track, you don't want it to sound hollow in that area. I've got this multimeter, and when I'm looking at what's going on, you want it to look fairly even across the board with this analyzer. You want your frequency spectrum to be somewhat even. I mean, it's not going to be, you don't want it to just be a solid straight line, but you want things to look fairly even. I mean, my lows might be a little bit higher, my highs might be a little bit higher in spots. That 400 range might be a little bit lower, but you don't want to see a giant dip in that range, if that makes sense. So for instance, I've got this cut here. A lot of my synths are going to have this area cut out. The 400 to 500 hertz range is going to be cut out. But, I've got instruments such as my snare, where I've got that area boosted a little bit. I've got my what else? I don't know. I've got other instruments that are kind of boosted in that area, or not cut in that area, so that they're going to take up that space. But there's certain instruments that don't need to be taking up that space, and they'll sound better with that cut out. So this sounded better with that cut out. This 1200 hertz range I cut as well. I tend to cut things that don't make a huge difference on the sound. So what I'll do is I may just find some range, make a cut, see if it makes a difference. Or another way to test things for negative sounds is to boost it. So for instance, this 400 hertz range, if I boost it 3 dB, you're going to hear how it's going to affect the sound in a negative way, which means that I can probably cut it. If I boost this 1200 hertz range, if I boost it at 7.5 dB, you're going to notice that the sound's going to sound really bad. Let me try that. To me, that got a little muddy. So what I'll do is sometimes I'll do a really big boost like this, and then I'll move it around. Until I find a spot that I don't like. Like that range, when it's boosted that high, sounds a little funky, so I know I could probably cut a little bit there. So that's why I did that. Then because this is just a higher ranged instrument, I decided to do a cut or a boost here. And now because this is EQ'd differently than everything else, it's going to sit in its own space. Now let's go on to this tri-saw. Okay, so you can hear when I bypass it, it's a lot higher. It warms it up. This EQing that I did warmed it up a little bit. Let me do that again. So you hear how that sounds a little bit warmer? This square is a higher frequency. So I want this one a little bit lower. I want this one to be a little bit warmer since this one was a higher pitch. I want this one a lower pitch. So I messed with the frequency so that they sat well together. And here's what I did with that. And like I said, I don't want to go through and explain. I'm not going to go through and explain every single one of these tracks on why I did what I did. Because to be honest, I don't really know anymore why I did what I did. I just know that it worked. But this will give you an idea of what's going on with the EQ. This 365 hertz range was what I was talking about with mud, right? So on this one, on the square, I cut that out, right? So I've got this 400 hertz range I've got cut there, and then this, there's not a ton going on in that range. I've got the Q somewhat wide, so it's cutting out some of that 300 hertz range as well. But on this one, I boosted it. So it's now filling that gap where I cut this one. I also, on the square, I cut out this range. This one, I boosted it. And I cut these lows, or I cut these highs. This one doesn't have the highs cut. So you can see, hopefully you can see a pattern now of what I'm doing. I'm EQing things differently so they all kind of sit in their own little place. Let's go to the bass. Bass is super important. Bass is really, really important to EQ your bass correctly. I can't stress this enough. Bass is a really, really tough one to EQ properly, but it's going to make a big difference on how you EQ your bass. You'll notice it when I was going through and I turned all of these EQs off. The bass sounded terrible. So doing that is going to make a big, big difference in your track. So let's hear what the bass sounds like with the EQ and without. So you can hear how much warmer that sounds when I have the EQ on. So with the bass, cut out that frequency range here at 30 hertz just because you don't need that. I've got cuts in my... I've got a cut at 120 hertz, and the reason I did a cut at 120 hertz is because my kick is taking up that range. So I want my thump from my kick. See, I've got 120 hertz here boosted 6 dB. I've got my bass cut a little bit at that 120 hertz range so that it's not taking up that same space because I still want my kick to be heard in that spot. Then I took out the mids because I took out some of the mids because you don't need those. I've got other instruments taking up that space. It's still taking up some. Like, it's not a full cut like this. Like, this is cutting all of it. This is only cutting some of it. So you're still getting some of it, but you're not getting as much. And And then I cut all these highs because you don't need those highs. You'll notice when I bypass this that the bass has a little bit more of a crispiness to it, because you've got those highs in there. Let me show you again. So hopefully that makes sense on how I did that and why I did that. Then this main lead. Here's that main lead with the EQ, and then without it. Okay, this instrument probably gave me the most trouble on this entire track to EQ this properly. This took a lot of going back and forth with soloing, with doing it within the track as a whole to try and get this one right. This instrument gave me so much trouble. With the EQ bypassed, you'll notice that there's a lot of bass in the sound. And that was clashing a lot with this bass. So that's why I have this cut, because I've got this bass taking up this range in here. I've got this bass kind of doing a lot of this, and I didn't want a lot of this in this sound. I also cut that muddy range. I did at 345 hertz. It's 345 is going to get a little bit of some mud, but not a ton. The Q is going to take care of some of that over here, where it's cutting a little bit up to the 500 hertz range as well. It's not cutting a ton, but it's cutting a little bit. And then these highs just helped take care of some of the harshness of it. Like I said, this one gave me a lot of trouble, and this was just small tweaks here and there until I just got it to sit just right. I can't stress enough how much of a pain in the butt this lead was to EQ properly for this track, which when you listen to it on its own, like just like this, it doesn't sound bad. That's no EQ. That's just what the sound sounds like. It doesn't sound bad at all. In the track, though, it did. It just would not sit right in the track. So that's what I'm talking about. Like, you may get an instrument in your track and you're like, okay, I really like this instrument. It sounds great, but it may sound great on its own and then it doesn't sound great in the track. My goal, since I really liked this sound, was to get this instrument to sound exactly the same in the track as it did when I soloed it. And because I'm cutting this stuff out and because this bass is taking up that range, when you hear these two together, they still say this instrument is still going to sound the same because of that. Hopefully that makes sense. This was just a bounce in place. This is just a higher pitched synth that's layered with this, and you can see the gain comes in like you're hearing more of it here because this main lead rolls off here at the end, so it gets quieter as this one gets louder. And then this one kind of starts taking the place of this one. You start hearing a little bit more of this one right about here. But here's this one. Let me move it farther so you can hear it at full volume. Okay, so right away, without the EQ on, when I bypassed it like this, right away, when I'm hearing this sound, I really like the way that it sounds on its own, but I can already hear the boxiness in it. So what I did was I cut out these lows again, roll this all the way up until you start hearing it affect the sound negatively, then roll it back. This was that sweet spot. But you're still hearing, I still got a little bit of some boxiness in there. So that's why I cut this 420 hertz range. I did a negative 3.5 dB cut with a really wide Q so that it's cutting out all this stuff. And that really, really helped. And then I just boosted this 5,500 hertz range just a tiny, tiny bit. And then I did a high cut as well to get rid of some of those really, really harsh frequencies. So yeah, again, here it is. You can just hear already how much cleaner that sounds with the EQ. Now let's do this lead. This, I believe, is the same synth as this. I think I used the same patch. I just did like a lead thing with it. So the EQ is going to be the same on it. So I won't go through that, but it's pretty much the same exact thing as this one. White noise. White noise is super easy to EQ. You don't really need to do a whole heck of a lot with white noise. You just want to cut all the low end stuff because it's such a high end sound, higher frequency sound. So cut out all these lows. Sometimes depending on how it's sitting in the track and what I want the white noise to sound like, sometimes I'll boost this mid-range section to get it to sound a little bit more hollow sounding. I want a more hollow sounding white noise, or I want a really bright, harsher sounding white noise, so I'll boost some highs. It really just depends. White noise really just needs to suit the track. So here's what I did with that. Here's what it sounds like with it bypass and without. You're not going to notice a huge difference. Yeah, not really any difference, which was the point. There's still with this, without this cut, there's still stuff going on down here, but I don't need to hear any of that. It's not affecting the sound at all, so just get rid of it again. Cymbals. Cymbals are difficult. I find cymbals are really difficult to EQ properly. Here's what I did with this. Here's with it bypassed. So you can hear how much harsher that is on the ears when I have this bypass. When there's no EQ going on, there's a lot of that high frequency that makes it really harsh. Here it is again. So when I EQ it, it's softening that harshness. It's not changing the sound a ton. It's just kind of, my goal was to soften that harshness a little bit. So here's what I did with that. This in here is what's softening that harshness. So that cut at 4400 hertz, and then rolling this at 10,000 hertz down 3 dB, and then doing this high cut, like that's going to help with that harshness. Trying to think of what else I could go through. Let's hear this ARP. Okay, so you can hear when I'm bypassing that it's not changing the sound a whole ton. I boosted this 500 hertz range because I wanted to fill some of those mids. Since I've been on a lot of this stuff, a lot of this stuff in here that we were just doing, I was cutting a lot of those mids. So this one I boosted those mids a little bit. Cut out all these lows because they're not doing anything anyway. This is a higher pitched instrument. So hopefully that makes sense. And there was this one. Okay. This one I took out a lot more highs. Boosted these mids a little bit. And because this one still had... Oops, that's the wrong thing. There we go. So this one still has, this first ARP has these highs. This one doesn't. It has this first one has this 1200 hertz range cut. This one doesn't. So they're gonna sit in their own little space. That is gonna be about it as far as EQing this goes. I don't really know how I can explain this any better. If you need more explanation and whatnot, just let me know. I'm more than happy to throw another tutorial together and go a little bit more in depth if you need on anything. A lot of EQing is just kind of messing with stuff until it sounds better. Once you're doing it long enough, you start to know what frequencies do what. So like I said, that, you know, your 80 hertz to 120 hertz, that's going to be your really subby bass frequency. So you want to leave room for your sub bass, and you want to leave room for your kicks in that range. Your kick punch is going to be like around your 120, maybe 200 hertz range. So on your sub bass, maybe do a tiny little cut at that range so that your kick and your sub bass sit really well together. Your like 375 to 525 range or whatever, that little spot is going to be your mud. Those are your low mids. That's your muddy area. So you can do a lot of cuts on instruments in that area. But just make sure that not everything is cut in that area, because you still want that range filled. You just want it filled with the correct instruments. Your like 1,000 hertz range is gonna be, it's gonna start getting into like that mid-high range. I don't know what. Yeah, I guess like your mid highs or your low highs, whatever you would consider that range. But that range can be a little bit tricky. Each instrument is going to be a little bit different in that range, but that range is gonna, if you boost that range, you'll notice a little bit of some harshness starting to happen at that range. Your like 10,000 hertz range and up is going to be really, really harsh. So yeah, just kind of knowing if you pull up just a blank EQ, let me pull up just like a blank EQ. Okay, so this, when it first pops up this EQ, it kind of gives you all your different ranges. You got your 30 hertz, which is nothing down there. 1700 hertz right here. There's nothing up there that's audible. So both of those that are kind of blanked out right now, those are inaudible anyway. So you can cut those on a lot of things because it's not audible. Then you've got this 80 hertz range. That's your sub. You've got this. This is some of that low punchy. 500 hertz is going to be that mud. This is going to start getting into your highs, but it's not super harsh yet. You can do boosts and cuts here at this 1200 hertz range that, won't affect. This range is actually a pretty good range. It's not going to affect your sound a whole lot when you do stuff in that range. 3500 hertz, it's going to start getting a little harsh. So if you've got things that are harsh, you can do some cuts in that range. And then like I said, your 10,000 hertz is really harsh. So you can roll some of that off on a lot of things. But your higher end instruments, you can leave it in there. Hopefully this makes sense. Hopefully you understand a little bit more after watching this, how to clean up your mixes. Like I said, if you feel like you need a little bit more explanation, just let me know. I'm more than happy to throw something else together. I don't really know what else to go over. Let me show you again what it sounds like. I'll A/B it again so that you can hear what it sounds like with the EQ and without the EQ. So you can really hear the difference that it makes. Okay, so again, here's no EQ. And then I'll go back to the one with the EQ on. So here's no EQ. Okay, this one has the EQ on. Hopefully you can hear a difference in that. Hopefully this helped. Hopefully this helped a little bit. Sorry about that. Hopefully this helped a little bit. Then when you go into your mastering stage, it really should just be turning the volume up. You shouldn't be doing a whole heck of a lot because your mix down should have been so good Your EQing should have been so good that you don't need to do EQing on your mastering channel. You don't need to do a whole lot other than turn the volume up. That's what I try and focus on mainly with mine. So I did another low cut on my mastering chain at 30 hertz just to cut out anything below that, just in case. Extra precautionary measure. I always do that. This is like a mid-side processor. This will kind of help separate your mono stuff and your stereo stuff a little bit better. I'm not going to go into this, but this is a great mid-side processing is great for mastering. Then I've got this multipressor, which is just a multiband compressor. Typically, what I do is I'll start with everything. I keep my ratios the same on it, and then I'll bring down the threshold until I start seeing movement. And then depending on how much it's reducing the gain, I'll boost that gain. And if you don't want it to change the sound of your track at all, make sure your makeup gain on all these is exactly the same. So long as it's compressing and reducing the volume at about the same. So when I go through, I make sure that I don't want any gain reduction on any of these bands to be more than like 3 dB. So because it's only compressing it and reducing the signal by 3 dB, I then boost this 3 dB. Now I boosted these mid highs 4.5, and I boosted the highs 4 instead of 3. So I mean it's 1.5 dB difference and a 1 dB difference. It'd be the same thing as going through and EQing the entire track and just boosting that range a little bit, but instead of doing that, I'm doing it with the multipressor. This just got it to sound a little bit crisper. Not that the warmth wasn't bad, or not that the warmth was bad. This just helped it to sound a little bit more like the track that the EQing on the track that I really liked. So the track that I was A-Bing this with, I really liked the EQ on that track. I really liked the way that track sounded. So I tried to emulate that the best as I could within my track. And when I had all these evened out with my mix, it sounded, it sounds great. I can show you. I can put these down to 3, and it's this 1.5 dB and this 1 dB boost is very, very, very minimal. You're not going to notice a huge difference on that, but it just helped bring out that extra little something in the track that it needed. And then this last one is just turning up the volume. So yeah, you can see I'm not doing a whole heck of a lot with my mastering, as far as changing the way the track itself sounds other than making it louder. I'm not going in and doing heavy EQing or anything like that. I want very subtle differences with my mastering. So here's that section. Let me show you. Play this whole thing with the mastering stuff put on so you can hear what it sounds like. Here we go. Okay, now if I go through and turn these off, other than the volume being softer, if you turn your volume up and listen to this now, with all my mastering stuff off, the sound itself isn't going to sound much different. It's going to be very, very subtle. Yeah, it's going to be quieter, and when you hear something quieter, it just automatically sounds a little bit different. But the audio quality, if you turn just your level up to adjust for the amount that you're turning the gain up on all this stuff, the sound isn't changing a whole lot. So all this mastering stuff is doing is just boosting the volume. I don't want it to change my sound a whole heck of a lot. So here's what it sounds like without the mastering stuff, and then I'll turn it back on. And you can hear it. Yeah, it's going to get louder, but the sound itself shouldn't change. So if you adjust your volume on your end to even them out, it shouldn't sound much different. So to me, the mix still sounds the same if I adjust my volume in my headphones to compensate for how much it's turning up the volume. When I turn on the limiter and the multiband compressor and all that, when I turn those stuff up, yeah, it gets really loud. But if I just compensate for that and I turn up the volume in my headphones when all this stuff is off, it still sounds the same to me. So yeah, hopefully that makes sense. Hopefully this kind of helps you out a little bit on how to clean your mixes up and make them sound good. That your mixes should sound great before you even get to the mastering stage, and then when you get to the mastering stage, it should just be turning up the volume. If you have questions, feel free to hit me up. All right, guys, later.